Okay, thanks, Don. Well, I'm really happy to be here. This is great. Thank you all for coming. It looks like we pretty much have all the chairs filled, so that's great. Yeah, as Don said, I've been working for the state for quite a while. I was talking to somebody earlier, and they asked me, what I do. What's my specialty? I'm like, gosh, I hesitated for a second because in this job I've worn so many hats over the years. With the natural resource damage program, sometimes I'm a lawyer, but the lawyers don't like it when I say that. So I'm definitely not a lawyer. I'm a scientist, and I work with hydrologists and geomorphologists and geologists and chemists and toxicologists and a variety of people. I guess if I had to pinpoint a specialty, it would probably be ecology as an ecologist. So with that, what I have planned tonight is to walk you through some of the work we've done on Silbo Creek, but I'm not going to just focus on Silbo Creek. I'm also going to talk about some of the other work we've done in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin. And by that, I'm talking about the area from Butte to Missoula, basically. And the reason that area has had so much attention over the years in terms of cleanup is because the area has been injured so much from all the mining from Butte and Anaconda, of course. There's about 17 different Superfund sites in Montana, but this one is by far the largest. I'm also going to talk some history, since we are in the Historical Society building. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Butte and Silbo Creek, and talk about the cleanup, and I even have some photos of some birds. So with that, Silbo Creek, first back, in the 1860s, miners started coming up here and placer mining along Silbo Creek, and I like this picture of this guy. I don't know if he built that cabin, but I'm sure he's a hard worker. I heard he's only 22. This is right along Silbo Creek, and what it says on the bottom, I guess anybody can read it. This is such a great screen. Old Parrot Tailings Dump looking east. So this, there is, like I say here, 11 smelters in Butte, and between 1880 and 1950 was about the last one was closed down in 1950. Of course, they had the big smelter in Anaconda where they brought the ore. But there was other lawsuits. I'm working with the Department of Justice, as Don said, and we sued ARCO and then British Petroleum for cleanup over the years, but also even back in this picture, which somebody told me is back in 1905, this gentleman to the right here supposedly was sampling for a lawsuit back in 1905 from all the tailings, which went all the way down the Deer Lodge Valley. Of course he lost, and Anaconda being a big company, did well, but a kind of interesting story I heard about that was that at the time, right around 1905, all the mining companies, they were all fighting each other. They're all trying to see who's on top. And because of this lawsuit, Anaconda Company kind of, took the lead, and they stopped fighting amongst themselves so they can figure out how they're going to fight this lawsuit. And with that came the beginning of the Anaconda Company. Waste were put along Silbo Creek for a long time, hundreds of years, and over 100 years. And sewer too. The sewer effluent for Butte went straight to Silbo Creek, Shit Creek. I'm sorry, Silbo Creek. They called it Shit Creek for a while, and until 1962, and that's when they stopped putting sewer directly into it. Although it's a long time. So I'm not sure exactly what year this picture is. I'm guessing 1920, let's say, area. And when you go to work, there was 10,000 miners that worked in the mines underground at that time, and I'm sure none of them heard birds when they walked to work, living here. And there's also about 10,000 miles of tunnels and stopes and stoops and all adits, all underground in Butte. And there's also 10,000, there's something else I forgot. Oh, no, I'm just kidding. Remember Perry forgot the third thing in the speech? This is election year. But, and the third thing about 10,000 is that I heard there was 10,000 mules that worked down in the mines. And what I heard is that when they went down there, that's it. They died there, and then they were brought up when they're dead. So, so over the, say, a 30-year span, 10,000 mules gave their lives Anaconda Company. The Columbia Gardens, I'm sure some of you here have been there. Can you raise your hands? How many people have been there? Oh, cool. Oh, wow. All right. So for those in front, about a dozen people raise their hands. So the Columbia Gardens were there, and what the story I've heard was, Anaconda Company came in and said, we got to move these guys. We got to move this because we want to mine this area. And there was a lot of opposition from the public, and it was kind of tenuous. And then all of a sudden, one night in 1973, there was a big fire, and that problem was solved. And the fire took out the whole Columbia Gardens in one swoop, so imagine that. And the reason I say here, good place for a pit, I'll come to that in a second. So just keep that thought. So I started talking about underground mining in Butte that went till 1955, and then they started the Berkeley pit, and working above ground. And then there was pumps underground, huge building I heard, and that was shut off by the Arco, Atlantic Richfield Company, who bought Anaconda Company, or really merged with them in 1976. And when they merged, copper prices weren't that great, and they were spending, I heard, like $1 million a day for these pumps to keep the water from, inside all the mines. So they shut them off in 1982, and the pit started filling in 83, and the rest is history. So right now it's the deepest lake in Montana. It's 1,000 feet deep, and very toxic water, very high in metals, cadmium, zinc, aluminum, a whole bunch more that I can't even pronounce. One thing happened in '95, I don't know if some of you remember, but 350 snow geese landed in the pit, and they all died, and obviously, and quickly. And at the time, Arco said the geese probably just ate some tainted grain in Canada that had some fungus in it. And they lost that argument, and actually helped us with the lawsuit. Because things like that, and we started actually trial in '96. So those 350 snow geese gave their lives, but it may be worthwhile. But I was talking to somebody earlier, and they said, "Are you going to talk about the Berkeley pit and the significance?" And of course, it's the headwaters of Silbo Creek, so we need to talk about Silbo Creek. I call it the gorilla in the room, the gorilla in Montana, if you would. So this critical water level, I don't know if you all have heard that term, but what it is when the bedrock water reaches the alluvium, and that's a critical water level. I don't know if it's exactly at that point, but somewhere in here is a level where the water will start going down Silbo Creek. It'll start reaching the alluvium, and that's significant because the water is so trashed in the Berkeley pit. So what British Petroleum, BP, has to do, which if you don't know, BP bought Arco in '99, they have to treat that water in perpetuity. That's going to be the solution for that. Remember I told you this is a good place for a pit where the Columbia Gardens was? Well, that's what's there now. This isn't the Berkeley pit. This is the Continental pit, which is next to the Berkeley pit. And so MR is working on that, and they have about 350 men working on that, and those 350 men are bringing up as much ore as they did in the Berkeley pit back in the heydays of the 50s and 60s. So in another decade or so, this pit will probably be the size of the Berkeley. I guess the one saving grace is there's not a lot of mine adits and stopes that are going into this area, so it's not going to fill up with water that bad. It looks a little bit better in the Berkeley pit, I think. So like I said, they're going to treat the water in perpetuity. And just an aside, MR is using a lot of that water. So MR, the actual treatment of the water and going into Silbo Creek itself probably won't happen until MR stops doing their work up there. But I want to start talking about natural resource damages now and a little bit about what that's about, and I'll get into more detail in a minute. But with the law, the Natural Resource Superfund law, we can also use monies to not only clean up injured areas, but we can use monies to replace the lost services that resource would have enabled people to have. And so in the circumstance of Butte, that water could be used for drinking. So we've actually spent, over the past decade and a half, $80 million to enhance Butte's infrastructure. And that's really helped them quite a bit. And when I say help with infrastructure, I'm talking about pipes. Pipes are the big hole to bring the water. That's where most of the water comes from. Treatment plants, things like that. So let's talk about Silbo Creek itself. We divide it into 4 sub-areas. And of significance, right here, about 10 years ago, a dam was put along the creek. And that allowed us to work both in this part of Silbo Creek and this part of Silbo Creek at the same time. All the tailings, mine waste from here to here went by rail to the opportunity ponds here, which I'll show you some pictures of in a few minutes. And all the tailings and mine waste in this part of Silbo Creek went to opportunity ponds via truck. And what else I want to mention? Here's German Gulch here, very significant source of good clean water, and West Slope cutthroat trout. There's a boatload of them in German Gulch, so they're coming in Silbo Creek as we speak. So I've talked about most of this. Large-scale mining over the decades have injured the aquatic health of Silbo Creek. And the tailings in themselves, what's in them is copper and zinc. That's the major things that are toxic to all aquatic life and to plants as well. And I'm talking about, when I talk about copper, we're talking 5, 10, 15 parts per billion is injurious to aquatic life. So not much. So let me start with an overview of the Silbo cleanup. Became a Superfund site in 1980. In '83, the state filed a lawsuit against ARCO for natural resource damages. The program got going about 1990. So the first settlement we had was in '99 with ARCO, and that was for $120 million of that went to my program, Natural Resource Damage Program, and 86 of that settlement went to clean up Silbo Creek. And DEQ took the lead in that cleanup with that $86 million of Silbo Creek. We worked with DEQ in enhancing what they did, but they took the lead in that initial settlement of that money. So I want to make that clear. And frankly, I think what helped us settle in '99 was 2 things. One, ARCO was merging with BP, so that was a driver. And the other driver was Silbo Creek itself. It was so hammered that I think ARCO really wanted to get that off the plate. So that probably helped the settlement as a whole. I mean, they fought hard. We had 40 experts, and they had their 40 experts, and their 40 experts made, I don't know, $300 an hour, and our 40 experts didn't make near that. I'm sorry, $400 an hour. And some of them were Nobel Peace Prize people, and they fought really hard. It was a tough lawsuit. I guess it was one of the biggest lawsuits in Montana. And it was up in Great Falls under Judge Hatfield, and the trial itself lasted about a year. And then we finally had a settlement in '98, but it was documented in '99. So this is the only slide I'm going to have where I'm going to just give a little bit of kind of explanation of something specific in terms of Superfund law. So basically what we have remediation and restoration. The law allows cleanup, throughout the country. I think there's 1,300 Superfund sites in the country. And so remedy is the actual cleanup of the hazardous substances with an emphasis on human health. What the human health kind of problems are. That's more the emphasis. Whereas restoration, we're more interested in natural resources themselves. We're interested in the resources that the trustee is in Montana. It's the governor who's a trustee of the natural resources that were injured, and specifically in the upper basin, the 3 resources are groundwater, aquatic life, and terrestrial, wildlife. Those are the 3 main umbrella of resources that we were trustees for, and that's what we focused on at injury assessments. So I listed here, one other point I want to make, we can return these, what the law allows us to do in restoration is far greater than what we could do under remedy. Under remedy, we clean up the site, that's it. Under restoration, we could do things like replace the lost services like I talked about in Butte. Not only can we do cleanup of groundwater in Butte, but in places like Berkeley Pit where you can't do a darn thing, we can actually use those money to replace lost services that were lost, i.e. drinking water. We can also replace lost services for wildlife and wildlife habitat by purchasing wildlife habitat, and we can also clean up aquatic, streams throughout the basin. We all heard of Deepwater Horizon 5 years ago when that happened. They got $8 billion for their natural resource claim. Louisiana got the bulk of that. Louisiana got about 5 of that 8 because most of the injury was in Louisiana. We all heard of Exxon Valdez back in 99, I believe. Was it 90? Yeah, 99, I believe. And I'm sorry, 89 was Exxon Valdez, and that was about $1 billion. And those monies, they spent quite a bit of that on replacement. There wasn't a lot to do in terms of the cleanup because Exxon did a lot of it. Exxon spent over $2 billion on that cleanup, but what they spent a lot of their money on was actually purchasing land in Alaska. And then our Clark Fork is about $220 million. I talked about one settlement in 99. Later on, I'll talk a little bit about another settlement we had in 2008. So I'll talk about some pictures here. So that's before construction in 99, when Silbo Creek started. That's 5 years later, in the same location. And that's maybe a couple years ago, whatever. And as I mentioned earlier, not only is copper and zinc toxic to aquatic life, but also phytotoxic to plants. So here we have obviously wildlife habitat along the riparian areas that was destroyed. That's post. So if you're looking at, I'll go back. If you look at, here I'm pointing to the screen. So if you look at that bush right there, it's that bush right there. And finally got some birds. Finally, jeez, guys, talk of it. 18 minutes, he hasn't showed a bird yet. And again, habitat. So we were kind of clever the way we did our habitat, injury to wildlife. It wasn't like Exxon Valdez, and certainly not like Deepwater Horizon, where they had dead mammals and birds all over the place. One statistic I heard was they had 6 trillion bugs lost, trillion with a T. And we didn't really go that way, but we focused on habitat and lost habitat, and that was our claim. So again, not much aquatic life here either. The tailings that came from Butte were up to 5 feet deep, in places. This is just another shot of what's called Ramsey Flats near Ramsey. I'm sure you all have driven by there over the years. So on the left here we get the train track, just kind of has a focus, and then that's what it looks like now. So I'll just go back a second. So that's what it did look like, and that's what it looked like. And again, this is 6 years ago or so, 7 years ago. But we created wetlands, and 9 years ago. Oh, is there a date there? Yes. Oh, jeez. And really? Yeah, I guess so. 2007. I'm pretty good at math too. One thing I definitely want to mention is that there was a flood in 1908, a big flood, 1,000-year event is what they said. So, and sure some of you have heard about that flood. I mean, we went all the way to Missoula, of course, and ramifications throughout the state back then. And so a lot of these tailings that, if you think of the map I showed you earlier, a lot of these tailings just whipped down all the way through Durant Canyon and all the way to this is more near, right next to Fairmont. And these willows have been dead since 1908. And a couple of geomorphologists I worked with over the decades. Geomorphologists are folks who study rivers. And again, these willows are just sitting there for 100 years. That's what it looks like now. So a little bit of a difference before or after. And Rocky Mountain bee plant is something my re-veg specialist loves to throw in there. That's just annual. That didn't come back the second year, of course. So we can talk a little bit about money again. I was talking to Dawn earlier, and even though I mentioned we got $86 million DEQ did for the cleanup on Silbo Creek itself, they smartly used that, pretty much just kept the corpus and just worked off the interest. And we did the same thing with the $120 million we got for natural resource damage money. So at the end of the day, there's about $60 million that DEQ had. So they spent 135. There's about 35 left over. Some of that's going back to NRD. and just by working off the interest over the years. So, and with the restoration program, we started with 120, and we had a grants program for 11 years, and then we still had 120 when we were done. So on the left here is brown gulch coming in, if any of you know that. So a couple weeks later, this is what it looked like. So again, his brown gulch to the left. This is back in the day before they had GPS and all the equipment, so everything's staked out, all these people staking things. Come a long way since way back in 2008 or so. One thing that's important for the re-veg, and what we need to do is actually get borrow area for everything we excavated. It needed more soil on top in many places, and so that's an example of borrow area. So all this, is borrow area. This guy on the left is that re-veg specialist I was telling you about, who's doing a really bang-up job on Silbo Creek. Probably one of the best seed experts in the West. His name is Rich Rogers. That's a year later. So you get rid of the tailings and things grow. Another shot of the wetlands from an airplane shot. Compost, we added organic matter, throughout what we did. Kind of cool right there, putting it in the compost. Of course, we had tree planters. Put a lot of plants in the ground. And re-veg is tough. We were 13 inches a year. Anybody who's done much re-veg, it's not an easy place. And what we kind of always like to do is, balance out our areas that we do work on, balance out the risks. And some years are good and some years aren't as good, and we have to redo re-veg in some places. But a lot of diversity. This is all by seed. So we can do a lot by seed, and you don't always have to plant your plants, your woodies. As a MCC group, tough people. It's not easy work. Some of the guys who planted trees over the years have been doing it for 20, 30 years, and just it's amazing. I don't know how they do it. Some guys could plant 1,500, 2,000 plants a day. Wetlands. One thing that's really cool about Silbo Creek and the 25 miles is that way back, in the 90s, the Greenway Service District was formed, and what they did is made sure that they worked with Remedy and Restoration, worked with us, and developed a trail on the whole way between Butte and Anaconda, and that's been going on. And we've been funding that through the NRD program. And again, as I mentioned earlier, with natural resource damage money, we can also use that money for replacement of lost services. And in this case, the 10 million or so spent in the Greenway is lost recreation use. So the law allows us to look at recreation and habitat.
Is that trail done now?
In 3 years it'll be done. Yep. They have to get through the canyon now, and they're getting there. They're working hard in these next couple of years. And if you guys want to ask me any more questions while I talk, feel free. I should have said that in the beginning. Durant Canyon is really cool. It's at 5 miles, kind of in the middle of Silbo Creek, and I got a few slides here of that area. It's a historic slide. The reason this is an ore train, they say it was the busiest railroad in the world for decades. And the reason, if you don't know, that all the ore from Butte went to Anaconda, and why the smelter was there is simple: water. Warm Springs Creek, that's why. Smelters need a boatload of water. So Anaconda, Daly was smart enough to go out, back in the day, build that smelter out there in Anaconda because of Warm Springs Creek. Butte just didn't have enough water. Silbo Creek wasn't, that much water, and so everything, all the ore. This is a concentrate. This is ore. Went to the smelter in Anaconda. This is kind of the same shot. Now, just put your minds back in 1908. There's a flood coming down here. So right here, the tailings were 15 feet thick when they hit this kind of bedrock cliff, but the tailings just whipped through this canyon 5 miles and tailings kept going, and I'll get into that in a minute. They didn't stop in Anaconda. They kept going all the way to Milltown. And it is a shot of construction going on in the canyon. Canyons, lots of wildlife there. And this is just last year. So as I said earlier, whoops, how come this is going up fast on me? As I said earlier, we were able to work on both sides of that dam that was taken down in 1915. So here's Don, scarred, doing fish monitoring back in 2002, 14 years ago. And with that backpack, what he's doing there when he walks around is that there's a tube in the back. You can kind of see it right there, a wire, I should say, and it chocks the fish in that immediate vicinity. And then a guy with a net behind him, and Don has a net too. There we can scoop up the fish. But back in 2002, we didn't scoop up anything, did we, Don? But things increased over the years. It's just amazing, really amazing how the fish came back to Silbo Creek. We had different areas we went and looked at for 10 years, and still will. We'll do it again this year. One thing I want to note is that we put a fish barrier here to keep the west slope cuts in this part of the creek and keep the rainbows and the brown trout from coming in. The water treatment plant in Butte, I mentioned earlier, they built a plant, but the plant really wasn't getting the NMP out as much as many plants in the state. So that's why I say here the fish densities in the upper part of Silbo Creek weren't that great because of the dissolved oxygen problems in that part of Silbo Creek. There it is. There's the first trout. What year did I say? 2006. So there's proof. So that wastewater treatment plant, I guess the good news is it's going to go online this year. $30 million plant, which Butte taxpayers paid for. And but the problems that has had is pretty significant with all the algae and along Silbo Creek has been quite significant. So I really have high hopes for this treatment plant.
Those fish are stocked?
No, they're mainly coming from German Gulch, coming down. We have brookies coming up from Blacktail too.
And are the trout edible? Are they toxic or edible?
I think they're edible. I mean, there's not that many studies. I mean, Don can answer better than I can, but I mean, people eat trout in Clark Fork River, but I think there's some warnings on Clark Fork River not to eat the trout, right, Don? I think.
The metals that are a problem there do not accumulate in muscle. It's mainly in the organs, like liver and kidneys. So the problem in muscle tissue is mercury, not copper or cadmium. So that's why you can say that with a straight face.
Sort of. All right. So here's a picture of that fish barrier that was completed in 2014. Even notice that old people, we talk about 19, we say 19. Sometimes it's just hard to say 20, it's 20 something. So, gosh, 19. Yeah, I love it when you meet somebody young, and when were you born? Oh, 1994. Wow. 2001. But like my mother says, who's still alive, she says, yeah, well, how do you think I feel, Well, my kids are getting older. This is Jason Lindstrom here. He's a great fishery biologist, and we work with Fishery Parks a lot in all this work we do. I talked about DEQ quite a bit, and they've done a great job, working with them, but we also work with Fishery Parks a lot in the fishery aspects and of course in other things that we do as well. Okay, so that's kind of it for Silbo Creek, but I figured since we're talking about the Clark Fork Basin, I want to talk a little bit more. Let's go a little farther. Let's talk about the Anaconda area a little bit, and then Clark Fork River, and we'll even talk a little bit about Milltown. So there's the opportunity ponds are right there that I showed you earlier on another map. There's the Warm Springs ponds right there. So they're they're the point where Silbo Creek goes into those ponds, and I have some pictures of those, but basically those are treatment ponds for the past 2.5 decades. And tailings went there and then all the way down the Clark Fork. And lots of tailings. I talked about 5 million that we cleaned up here, but there's 20 million in these ponds, and there's another 10 million along the Clark Fork. So here's a train being offloaded. And then I'm going to go up and down. Then I'll stop it from doing that. And then unloading a truck. And again, these tailings are placed in opportunity ponds. So what are these opportunity ponds? You don't really see them from the road that well, but they're 5 square miles and 130 million cubic yards. That's how much tailings are there. And they're called ponds is because when the smelter was in operation, they slurried what's called tailings, out to these ponds, so that they needed a lot of water. So they were wet, but now they're of course dry. And Silbo Creek, we put 5.5 million cubic yards on there. Milltown put 100 miles down, brought the tailings back by train, put 2.2 million cubic yards. And the Clark Fork, at least 4 million cubic yards over the next decade from the Clark Fork of tailings will be coming back to the opportunity ponds. By the way, ARCO covered these ponds, since this picture was taken, and it probably cost them $60 million to do that. So one thing I want to make clear, and I'll mention again, I hope, that the big player here, really isn't NRD and really isn't DQ. It's ARCO and BP. They're spending the millions, probably close to $1 billion by the end of the day of what they spent in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin. So just like when I talked about Exxon Valdez, when Exxon spent over $2 billion trying to get rid of the initial oil along the Alaskan coast, it's the same thing here. They're spending a lot of the money. So Warm Springs ponds, I think worth mentioning. They were first built in 1918. In the 50s, the bigger ponds were developed. There's 20 million cubic yards of tailings in those. So you can imagine that's quite a lot of tailings, and they're covered by water, so no oxygen is getting to them. So there's still aquatic life in those ponds. Now we don't have to treat that water, coming from Silbo Creek much longer because Silbo Creek's been cleaned up. So we'll see what happens. Those ponds, EPA and the state will make those decisions over the next couple years. But ARCO spent about $40 million on these ponds back in the early 90s. They saw right away the threat if there was an earthquake or another big flood. So they made these ponds, these dikes are, made of cement along the whole 2.5 miles, and to handle the 500-year event. And this is called Millwell Bypass, of course, that y'all see when you're driving down the highway. And they had 500,000 cubic yards of tailings, and they were removed during the early to mid 90s. So again, the future's uncertain exactly what to do with the ponds, but of course they have great wildlife habitat there. Here's a close-up of the lime silos that have been there for, I'm going to say, at least 12 years, the big ones. There's a smaller one before. And the metals do drop out in there. There's arsenic coming out of the ponds now, but the copper's, it works pretty well getting the copper out that's coming down Silbo Creek. Finally, he's got a close-up of birds. Gary Swant lent me this for a shot he took at Warm Springs Ponds. So again, great wildlife habitat and bird habitat. So back to the smelter. Sorry, one picture of birds and then he goes back to BP has spent well over $100 million in the Anaconda area. I talked about Silbo Creek, and I talked a little bit about Butte, but boy, there's a lot of work in the Anaconda area. And again, as I mentioned, Warm Springs Creek was important for that smelter to come in. You can see these ponds below here. Now they're of course still wet here, like I was explaining earlier. These dried up, of course, after the smelter closed down in 1980, and ARCO capped those, for about, I don't know, 10 million or something. But the opportunity ponds, the 5 square mile ponds, are back over here. These are just 1 square mile. These are 100 feet thick. The opportunity ponds are 25 feet thick. So there's 100 million cubic yards in those guys. So as smelter closed in 1980. It was tough in Butte when the smelter closed, and I mean when all the mining closed in Butte, but also here in Anaconda. I think there was at least 3,000 guys working at the smelter. They were without a job overnight. And again, I just want to make sure, I touched on the history with, Atlantic Richfield merging with Anaconda Company in 76 and BP buying AR in 99. And there's rumors out there that Shell's going to buy BP. Yeah, the corporate world. If we only understood it better, right? Now around the stack, I talked about riparian areas being hammered by tailings, but in the uplands, this is right on the Continental Divide. You guys go ski over, at Mill Creek. There, copper, zinc, also phytotoxic to plants, and not much growing in some of these places. And I want to touch a little bit on, again, not only can we use the money for cleanup, but we can use natural resource damage monies for replacement of lost services. So what are the lost services that we lost here around the stack? Hunting, fishing, and services of wildlife, and they have worth too, ecological services to them themselves. So we bought Spotted Dog. That was a controversial purchase near Deer Lodge for $15 million 4 years ago. Again, as a replacement of lost services. We also bought the Garrity Mountain purchase. So over the years, and this is by Anaconda, you can see the stack. If you guys aren't familiar with the Garrity Mountain wildlife management areas. But over the years, we spent about $25 million so far. So far, we got another $25 million to spend on purchasing wildlife habitat. So, Clark Fork River. Let's talk a little bit about that. Some of you may remember, I bet you do, and others. Oh, I got a question, sure.
On that last slide.
Sure.
How did you treat that area to bring that up?
Oh, the real bad stuff?
Yeah.
Up there? We're working on that now. It's not a heck of a lot you can do, frankly. And a lot of the metals aren't even there anymore on some of these slopes. So they've already came off because a lot of these are southern aspects. And so what we're focused on is revegetating some of the areas close to the stack. And these areas aren't producing that much metals into the system. But like I said earlier, copper, just a tiny bit of copper, get in the system, that exceeds standards. So 3, 4, 5 parts per billion copper. So this whole area, the headwaters of Mill Creek is exceeding copper standards. So we're working on it, but there's not a lot we can do in some of these areas, but we're trying. And ARCO hasn't done anything in uplands yet. They're still on the hook to do a lot of work up there too. They've done some of the work on the easy fruit, hanging fruit, I guess. They got a lot to do. So in the Clark Fork River, during our injury assessment in the 90s, we found that fish were about 1/5 baseline of our baseline control streams and reference streams, I mean. And it ran red because of the Butte discharges. And about 1972, they started doing some treatment of that water, and so I guess since then the river didn't run red.
I have a question.
Sure.
The older I get, the more my memory forgets, but it also makes things up. And I recall, and I'm just wondering if this is a possibility.
Yeah, I'm there now. But
Driving on the highway outside of Butte and seeing creek or a ditch about 5 feet wide running tidy bowl blue. Now, that says running red.
this is recently, or?
No, this
No.
is sometime between 1967 and
Oh.
1969.
Wow. Huh.
But I'm just wondering
Interesting.
if, scientifically that's possible, or my sunglasses were.
Well, the tailings certainly turned blue. The salts, the copper salts, wicked up to the top, and I guess it caused the water to be blue for short sections. The groundwater in Butte's blue around the pair of tailings. So on the Clark Fork, 15-year cleanup started, 3-4 years ago? And again, we had a 2008 settlement, so very similar to the settlement in 99. We received about $100 million for other natural resource damage claims that we didn't settle in 99. And we got $100 million approximately for cleanup of the river itself under remedy, and DEQ, again, of course, took the lead on that. So DEQ has $100 million to spend on remedy there, and we in NRD have money to spend either helping DEQ with some restoration above and beyond what they're doing remedy, or we spend some of that money on replacement of lost services, such as buying land or doing work on tributaries from Butte to Missoula, which we are doing. So I promise you I'll get to Milltown, and this was again another $100 million site, and this was really interesting because we had really good cooperation here in terms of EPA was the lead, but BP of course did the work, and they hired Envirocon, but it was a lot of coordination, a lot of work, but it was a great project, and DEQ and NRD worked hand in hand with EPA and BP in this. I'm not going to say it went smoothly. Nothing, when you deal with big dollars like this, nothing necessarily goes smoothly, and there's egos, and there's people want their way or not that way, and so there's always a battle. But I think Milltown's been a success. The powerhouse here was something that NRD focused on, should go, and it did. And that was the first to go, and of course the dam is history. And I guess this is a good slide to kind of demonstrate that we in Montana have worked pretty well in terms of remedy, restoration, coordination in the basin. And I've been to meetings. This is probably maybe at least another 15, 20 other states that have NRD programs, and I just think it's working better here than any place I've seen in any of the other states, or stories I've heard, or discussions I've had, or things I've read. It's really quite exciting. A lot of other states, sometimes they just have the PRP, the responsible parties for the injuries. They do all the work, and the state may do nothing. But here we've all worked together, and I think a lot's been done. We got more to go, of course, but it's been fun. So now I am going to talk about birds. We monitor birds starting in 2005, and kind of like the fish, when there wasn't many. Something flew over, of course. But I don't know if you guys know Nate Kohler, Deer Lodge. Have you heard that name? And so he's helped us in the past decade. Look at what we have out there. Now we're up to 140 species on Sybil Creek, which to me is just amazing, compared to what we had before. But in some of those pictures I showed you earlier, Ramsey Flats or whatever. So that's really been fun. So what's that? Anybody know? Huh? Look at that. Okay, I'll give you a hint. Look at that beak right there. Marsh hawks. Huh? Sandhill? Right. Good. Right, red-headed grebes. Redneck. Red-headed. The head's not red, it's the neck. See, I'm colorblind, so it really makes things difficult sometimes. All right, avocets, of course. Isn't that cool? It just takes up the whole slide. Got geese and ducks here. Okay, who can guess what those eggs are? Let me see how much money I have on me. I work for the state. I got $4. Who can guess this one? I think Wilson snipe. Aren't they beautiful? It's cool. Right. Got a little saying here from David Conowitz, which I thought was appropriate. This is the paper just like a month ago, about the time Don asked me to give this talk. So I said, oh. So thanks. Appreciate it.